Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. As you've heard before, the teaching about not-self, anatta, is central to the Buddha's teachings. Now, when people first encounter this concept, it seems counterintuitive, and it remains for a long time elusive and seems difficult to get a handle on. But it's well worth making the effort to understand it. There are a great many benefits to getting past the illusion of a self. Having a concept of self is a kind of a straitjacket on the mind, a prison. The mind is constrained in a narrow bound. And it's one of the mind's own making, because in the last analysis, the concept of a self is entirely a false one. It's one without substance. There are very real, immediate benefits for transcending in any degree the attachment to a self. People suffer a great deal from purely mental causes. Our minds can, in many ways, torment us. And these kinds of internal suffering, if we look at them, they all have a reference to a self position. Various kinds of negative mind states can be very burdensome. And taken to some extreme, they have what's called in modern terminology a state of depression. As an example, it's a kind of profound sadness and lethargy and sense of hopelessness. And this can seem like a very dark place to be. A state of depression is very much bound up with the concept of a self. It is essentially a very self-centered kind of mind state. One is burdened to a point of obsession with one's personal issues. Getting beyond a state of depression is not easy. It can seem extremely heavy and oppressive and impossible to shake off. But the reality is, it's just a mind state. It's ephemeral. There's nothing really there. It's another case of being caught in mental formations and concepts, and the associated extreme unpleasant vedana. The feeling tone is very unpleasant. To get out of those kind of mind states, one really needs to get beyond the self, get beyond obsession with self. So what I have observed is the most effective kind of practice for that is service, to get out of oneself and do service for others. This is very helpful in a number of ways. It gets the person outside of the obsession with self by referencing to others, and it also encourages activity, which helps to shake off the lethargy associated with depression. I would also say that, to my understanding, I don't think a person who has attained to stream entry could ever be really depressed. having glimpsed the unconditioned and shaken off the coarsest form of self-view, Sakaya Ditty, which is reference to self based on conceptual formations, on dittis, on thought or view, it's no longer possible for them to be so self-obsessed. And it's also one of the teachings about attaining stream entry is that that person is no longer subject to a lower rebirth. They cannot be reborn lower than human. So I think it's a fair extrapolation from that to say that their mind state cannot sink to the lower levels. There's like a new floor that mind can't sink below. The state of mind of depression is definitely a lower mind state, equivalent perhaps to Peta realm, type of lower, very constricted and dark and limited kind of consciousness. And blowing away the sense of self, blowing away that box, that constriction, then the mind can no longer fall below a certain level. Likewise, states of remorse, anxiety, fear, these are all self-referential. There's also a time referent involved in these states. One can fall into unpleasant or negative mind states by dwelling on the past, and having regret or remorse for things done or left undone, or for the loss of things and pleasures one previously had that one no longer has. One can fall then into negative mind states associated with unpleasant feeling tone. And this is also very much tied up with the concept of self. Memories arise, whether pleasant or unpleasant, if there's a sense in the mind, this is me, this is mine, then it's going to affect the mind in a different way than if one sees it as just as unfolding of impersonal phenomena. It's actually fairly easy to approach with the mind the illusory nature of self and the time dimension. You can think back to when you were younger, even when you were a child. You had quite a different body, quite different thoughts, quite different emotions, quite different likes and dislikes. Well, you were a quite different being. And it's only a conceptual reference based on the continuity of consciousness that one can identify that as me. There's no other reason to do so. And all these attributes of a person, the body, the mental formations and so on, they're changing moment by moment. This bundle of aggregates is not the same as it was yesterday. It's not the same as it was an hour ago or a moment ago. It's constantly changing. But because the changing constituents in subsequent moments tend to resemble each other, there's a sense of continuity. And we build a illusory sense of self around that. So if you abandon the concept of me and mine, then there's no remorse or regret possible to arise in the mind if there's not a self-reference. See events that unfolded previously in your life in the same way you would regard ancient history. If you were reading about events that transpired in the Peloponnesian War, it's not me, not mine. These are things that transpired. When we look forward in time, the mind can fall into anxiety and fear. And this is very much centered around a concept of self, of me and mine, and wanting to protect and preserve this entity and its accoutrements. If we abandon the sense of me and mine, then there's nothing to fear. This is one of the attributes of an arahant, is that they're absolutely fearless. Fear does not arise for an arahant, much less anxiety. I think it's significant too that the sense of a self, whenever it arises, tends to have these time reference. In the present moment, there isn't really any room for a self. There's just an object and mind knowing the object in any single moment. Self only comes into the picture when we allow the mind to run over a stream of time. We create a self out of the past by referencing, our life history, where we come from, what our name is, what we do for a living, where we went to school, who we used to know. This is kind of an identity built up from these kind of biographical or historical details. And the sense of self is created. But in the present moment, there's just mind knowing an object. Likewise, running the mind forward into the future, we create a self around either hopes and desires of attaining something that we want, or fears or anxieties about losing something that we have. And again, there's a self-reference, a me and a mine. This is me and these are mine. These are my things. I'm afraid I'm going to lose them. In the present moment, there's really nothing to cause us fear or to cause remorse or grief or any other kind of negativity. There's just an object. Even if the object is associated with painful sensation, then it's just a painful sensation in the present moment. When we have painful sensations, say bodily sensations caused by illness or by injury, it can overwhelm the mind and we can feel it's unbearable. But the reality is it is bearable in the present moment. In the present moment, a single moment, one can bear anything. But where it begins to feel unbearable is we project it into the future and think, how long can this go on? But in the present moment, it's just as it is. It's just a painful sensation. There's a great deal of confusion that can arise in the mind associated with the self, with me and mine. Because we're not seeing things clearly and in an unbiased, absolutely equanimous fashion. We're referencing things according to what's in it for me. Is this good for me or bad for me? Then the mind is not clear. It's muddled by this self-interest. The only way to see clearly is to abandon the concept of self and just see phenomena as they arise in their own nature. This is the tricky work that we try and do with the meditation, with vipassana, is developing a completely equanimous state of mind, seeing phenomena arise as they are, without picking and choosing, without referencing their value to me. This includes the phenomena of feeling tone. Pleasant or unpleasant are just that, just pleasant or unpleasant. And if we're chasing after the pleasant and avoiding the unpleasant, then we're referencing a value judgment on that, and a value system reference to a me and a mine. And it's tricky to shake that off and to be able to sit in an equanimous position and simply regard all phenomena as they arise with the same regard. I've got a cartoon that I photocopied out of a book years ago. It's been sitting pinned to my wall for probably decades now. It was two kind of shaggy Indian yogis. One of them sitting on a bed of nails, and he's talking to the other one, and he says, "It only hurts when I exist." And I thought that's brilliant. This is the underlying principle that I'm trying to express here. It only hurts when you exist. If you can just see in bodily formations, just bodily formations, in mental formations, just mental formations, in feelings, just feelings, and so on, and not see them as me and mine and something that needs to be protected and preserved and feel anxious about, then you're free. There's no sense of suffering in the mind. You can't lose what you've never had. And there are different degrees or levels of this sense of self, and they're overcome gradually and finally eradicated by the various stages of awakening. The coarsest form is Sakaya Ditty, which is a personality view, is the usual translation. Sakaya means own body. It's an own body view. And Kaya doesn't necessarily mean body in the physical sense, but body as an agglomerate structure. So it also includes like mental formations. So the idea is this formations are mine. This is me, this set of formations. And it's said to exist at the level of Ditty, which is view, literal translation. Ditty is, view is an excellent word to translate Ditty because it has the dual meaning as in English. A Ditty can be a view in the sense of a view that you see with your eyes, but it's more often used in a technical sense, meaning a mental view, like views and opinions, how we view the world, our Weltanschauung. This is a Ditty. And if one has the Ditty of self, this Sakaya Ditty, then that means there's a conceptual acceptance of the idea of self. Now this can exist in a person either implicitly or explicitly. If the person's not, philosophically inclined, they don't think about these things very much, they might just implicitly accept the idea of the self. It's just like taken for granted without being thought out. But it can also be explicitly held as a worked out theory, as a soul view, or as a psychology based around the idea of a discrete ego. And the religious views, like a theistic view of an eternal soul, is a explicitly worked out form of Sakaya Ditty. And it can be attenuated because it's a view and exists as a form of mental formations. It can be attenuated with the skillful use of mental formations. And this is where contemplation of two particular types of teachings are useful. One is the Abhidhamma approach, which is to break up the being, the psychophysical organism, into component parts. So instead of seeing it as a compact unit, you see mind, body, and you break these up in various organs of the body, various functions of the mind, and then in the end you don't find anywhere a self. You find a lot of interacting parts. The other teaching that's useful to attenuate the idea of self is dependent origination, which teaches us that things are interdependent, that they arise from causes and conditions. And we have the specific dependent origination as the 12 nidanas that begin with ignorance and lead through all the 12 stages to birth, old age, and death, which explains how this particular situation of being a human being comes about and unfolds. But every phenomena in nature, in the world, is dependently arisen. Everything arises according to causes and conditions. It's an axiom that nothing arises without a cause and nothing arises from a single cause. Also, it's a complex web of relationships. And this breaks up the idea of self because you can not find anywhere in this web of relationships a self-existent entity. Everything only exists as reflections, results of other things. There's no self-existent being, process, or entity anywhere. And deep contemplation of these truths are from two different directions. The Abhidhamma approach breaks things down smaller and smaller, and the dependent origination works by looking wider and wider. And both of these attenuate the idea of a self. But this intellectual approach can only go so far. It's like a mathematical asymptote, a function that approaches zero but never reaches it. You can get infinitely closer to the 0 point without quite reaching it. But you prepare the mind to make the leap, the instinctive leap, shorter and easier. And even a partial grasp of the idea of anatta alleviates a great deal of suffering. You can remind yourself when you find yourself in a state of suffering, not me, not mine. And that can be very effective for shaking off burdensome mental states. But Sakaya Ditty is only really completely done away with and eradicated by stream entry, which is a glimpse of the unconditioned. When the unconditioned has been known, even just a glimpse, then it completely changes the relationship of the mind to the idea of self. It can no longer see that as something valid or real or worth taking into serious consideration. It's like, as an educated adult person, you couldn't seriously hold the idea that Santa Claus is real. You might be able to play with the idea for fun, just imagine it, but you couldn't really believe it. It's not possible. It's the same with a stream winner cannot possibly entertain the idea of a self as being real. It just seems as ludicrous as the idea of a Santa Claus. But that's only the beginning. Someone who's attained stream entry is called, in many suttas and the Buddha's classifying different types of beings, they're called a Seka, which is a student or a learner. So that in one sense you're really only on the path after stream entry. That's really just beginning. And then Aseka is an arahant. That means someone who's not a student, someone who's gone beyond learning, because they've done it all, they've completed it. So if Sakaya Ditty is overcome, there still remains two additional, deeper, more fundamental layers of self-view. There's a kind of a middling layer that is weakened by stage of Sakadagami and fully overcome at the stage of Anagami. This is a type of self-reference that's based on sensuality, and I think you could best call it like selfishness. So that even though the person might have eradicated the concept of a self, there's still a self-reference in that, I don't believe in me, but I want that cookie for me. There's still this kind of selfishness built around sensual craving that's tied up with sense desire, but also with the desire to be and not to be. And these are still present in the mind as deep defilements after the conceptual idea of self is eradicated. And this type of self-reference is weakened and attenuated by practice of generosity and selflessness, by getting, not giving in to your urges to favor yourself, but to be open-handed, generous, kind, and compassionate to others. But even when this is overcome, as anagami, the third stage of awakening, is someone who has overcome all the lower defilements, no longer has any sensuality, no longer has any ill will, but there's still a subtle sense of self that's called asmimana. And this is translated very often as conceit or as the I am conceit. And it's kind of tricky to get a handle on what this actually means. There are, that I've come across, three approaches to understanding this, three kind of descriptions. One that comes up in a few places is talking about the three kinds of asmimana, the three kinds of conceit, three forms that I am conceit takes. The conceit that I am better than you or superior to you. The conceit that I am lesser than you, I am inferior to you. And the third one is the conceit that I am your equal. And all three of these are conceits. And the second approach is given as a metaphor. The Buddha often spoke in the parables or metaphors, and he said, consider if you're washing a dirty garment in soapy water. If you wash it in soapy water and get rid of the dirt and take it out of the water, it's clean now, but it still smells of soap. That's having gotten rid of the dirt. It's like Sakaya Ditty, and a clean garment is like a stream enter. But now if you rinse it and get rid of the soap and pull it out of the water, it's completely clean. That's like getting rid of asmimana. And that's no residue of self at all. But it's the third approach that I find the most evocative or useful, is what it's based on. We say that Sakaya Ditty is based on view, and the middling sort of self-reference is based on selfishness and sensuality. This form of self-reference, the asmimana, is based on the faculty of perception. It's a corruption of perception. One perceives wrongly. And I take this to mean that one still has a lack of relativity, a sense of having a privileged perspective. Here is me, and there is everything else. And like this point that I reference the universe from, I consider as me. This is a very much more subtle. It's not a question of thought or mental formation or belief. It's a way of perceiving. So it's very much more subtle and ingrained and difficult to even apprehend that we're doing it. So this shows us how really deep-rooted this referential sense of a self is, that it's only really overcome by the Arahant. The Arahant is one who has completely transcended any sense of self-reference. No negative mind state whatsoever arises in the mental continuum of an Arahant. An Arahant is without fear, without anxiety, without sensual desire, without ill will, so forth. An Arahant is said to be the master of the pathways of his mind. His thinking is entirely under his own control. And I think we could even, put it in terms that are a little bit maybe more approachable from a modern perspective and say that an Arahant is the only completely sane person. Anyone who's not yet an Arahant is still suffering from some taint of mental illness. And only the Arahant is completely free of that. And it's in large measure because he has freed himself from this delusionary idea of a self. That there's no reference either in terms of concept or desire or perception of a self-reference. So then the mind is completely liberated. It's shaken off the last shackles, laid down the burden.
And Mayam Dhamma Tataya Sadhu Kalam Dada Maste Sadhu